presentation, I'm going to look at primarily how exactly the entire construction of historical narratives have undergone a tremendous change from around 1980s, from around late 20th century onwards. I'm very specifically looking at an area which is not considered as being very important. I'm looking at an area which has been neglected for quite some time, and it has picked up the interest of scholars from around 2000 onwards, where one is looking at buildings, monuments, structures, not just as economic, not just as aesthetic representations, but they're also looking at it as very powerful sources for the construction of history. So I'm going to start my entire presentation by showing, or by let us look at some of the structures. Let us look at some of the monuments. I'm going to explain a little bit about the monument, and then we are going to cross over into that part of the presentation where we begin to look at history in a way that has not been so far constructed, or we are going to construct the entire historical narrative in a manner where the source materials are being shifted to more visual rather than more literary. Now, this first slide is the Borobudur temple complex in Indonesia. And very interestingly, this temple complex, it's a stupa, it is not a Hindu devalaya. It's a Buddhist structure, or it's a Buddhist stupa complex. And this complex it was started as a Vaishnava center. Then when the Buddhist rulers ascended the throne in Indonesia, in Bali, and in Java, Sumatra area, they immediately Vaishnava, the Hindu rulers ascended, they tried to take back the control. So constantly, this structure was at the center of political unrest, at the center of political control by the emperors. And this is way back, I mean, in the area of Cordoba in Spain. Now, the biggest church or the biggest mosque is not in Arabia, but historically it is at a place called Cordoba in Spain. And this mosque has also been a center of enormous conflict. As you can see on the screen, there is an iron grill. And this mosque in the beginning was a temple during the time of the Roman civilization or Roman period. And then after that, when Rome became a Christian empire or a Christian center, the Roman emperors converted this into a church. And then with the arrival of the Moors or the Arabic conquest through the Straits of Gibraltar, when they entered into Spain, the Muslims converted this into a mosque. So constantly, this entire structure at Cordoba was changing hands between the Islamic and the Christian rulers. And even today, it is at the center of controversy where the Muslims have been petitioning the papacy, requesting them. There is an iron grill, and it has been partitioned into a Christian and a Muslim center. So one of the major demands of the people or the followers, believers, is to hand over the entire mosque to them in total, which has not happened. This is another view of the mosque, the Cordoba Mosque. And then this is the cathedral. Is a cathedral which is known for its Catholic structure. It's a Catholic Roman structure. Very interestingly, it has taken around 1,800 years to build this cathedral, the Cologne Cathedral. And the issue here is that this cathedral was started by a Catholic ruler, but then during the period of Renaissance, the entire German territory became more Protestant because there was Martin Luther, and Lutheranism became a significant faith. And so Germany leaned more towards Protestantism than Catholicism. And so they stopped constructing, or they stopped patronizing this Cologne Cathedral. However, interestingly, by 19th century, when the German unification movement was launched, the rulers realized, the German state realized that it needs the support of both the Catholics and the Protestants in order to unite, because Germany was just a confederation of very, very small states. So as a result of this political consideration, immediately they started patronizing the Cologne Cathedral, and this cathedral became the center of political arguments and political articulations in Germany. Now, this is the internal view of the cathedral, and this is, of course, the Angkor Wat temple in Cambodia. Once again, this temple has always witnessed a tug of war between the Buddhist, the Jaina, and the Hindu rulers of Cambodia, who constantly try to reclaim their authority, reclaim their control over the Angkor Wat structures. So this is the mosque at Istanbul, the Blue Mosque at Istanbul. This is the outer look of the Blue Mosque, and this is the internal look of the Blue Mosque in Turkey. This also has a strong political connection. This was constructed by Sultan Abdul Hamid, and one of the strange idea here was that whenever the sultans of Turkey waged a major campaign or fought a major war, and whenever they won a campaign, they would always bring back the conquered treasury or the captured treasury and construct or bring in construction. But then the Blue Mosque was born out of the desperate need of the Sultan, because the Turkish Sultan was defeated in the war against Persia or Iran, and the citizens were very unhappy with their monarch. In order to pacify those citizens, he took money from the state treasury and constructed the Blue Mosque. And that also brought in a lot of disgruntlement, because till then, till around 16th century when the mosque was constructed, there was no history of sultans ever constructing mosque by picking up or by using the state exchequer or treasury for the construction. So there was a lot of unhappiness, a lot of opposition by the ulemas, by the Maulvis and Muazzims, etc. But then the Sultan went ahead as a way of winning back the support of his people. This is another view of the Blue Mosque in the evening. So now we come to, sir, am I audible? Are the slides audible? Can you see the slides?
Audible and visible.
Okay, thank you. So all these images that I showed were primarily as an introduction to understanding how the stagnant positions in relation to structures has drastically altered from around 20th century. Because till around 20th century or so approximately, construction of historical narratives was constantly on the basis of literary records. Whether it was ancient, medieval, or modern history, literary records acted as a main conduit of information or data for a historian. So either it could be epigraphs, inscriptions, or it could be various state records, court records, or it could be records in the archival sections of the state. So literary records were considered as the main channel for constructing historical narratives. But from around 1980s, I should say, from around 20th century onwards, there was a drastic shift in this entire approach towards looking at source materials to construct history itself. And there were a number of areas were brought in. For example, films were no longer considered as just as entertainment medium, but films were now considered and are now considered as visual text. So are documentaries, so are photographs. So all of those materials that existed became data or became the foundational aspect for constructing historical narratives. So this change in that position is applicable to structures also. Earlier, traditional historians or traditional teaching of history constantly looked at any building or any monument as a contribution of the state, of the patron to the society. But the building or monument was never considered as the primary source for gleaning or inferring history. So from 20th century, late 20th century, historians all over the world began arguing that buildings or monuments are not just aesthetic, They are not just dynastic and stylistic affiliations. Who constructed when and what style is it? Is it a is it a Baroque style of architecture, neoclassicism, or in Indian context, is it Indo-Saracenic, or is it Nagara, Dravid? So stylistic orientations was what labeled or titled monuments, and that was being questioned. For example, counterfactual history emerged. It was also called as what if his approach in history by Robert Monroe and Robert Crawley and others. And all of them argued that it is much better to ask pertinent questions of how do these buildings matter in the construction of historical narratives. So a search for parallel sources began, and from 1940s onwards itself, oral traditions and oral narratives became a part of the process of constructing history. So whether it was performing arts, whether it was memoirs or mass media would be photographs, documentaries, even to the extent of we have now visual text, or we have graphic novels. Graphic novels are something related to the cartoons that we used to see, or the comic text that we used to see. So they are now called as graphic novels. And all of these mass media, popular media, including advertisement, is now considered as a very, very revelatory experiential sources for construction of history. Hence, when one looks at the way historical narratives are constructed, the argument for the traditional sources, as in literary sources, was that there was always one of the questions that historians constantly, traditional historians constantly are in a dilemma with is how authentic and how believable are these new sources, as in if one uses a building or a temple or anything for that matter, how do they become authentic? There is a problem of authenticity vis-a-vis that of a notion of what is truth. And the question that traditional historians posed was also that there could be a lot of ideological prejudices, ideological biases that creeps up while looking at non-literary sources, and that may lead to a kind of ruptured understanding of history. But then this has been strongly rejected by the new wave historians, arguing that all of these, that is, whether it is ideological bias or whether it is problems of authenticity or the traditional sources of retrieval, they have argued that whatever is the accusation against looking at these new sources, whether they are oral traditions or visual media or advertisement or jewelry or whatever it is, whatever objections are being raised for these new ways of constructing history are applicable also to literary sources. So, as a result, their argument is that perhaps a historian should start actively engaging with these new developments or new changes that are coming in. So, as a part of this initiative, today, structures or buildings or monuments, whether they are just monuments or whether they are buildings, it does not matter. It does not matter whether they are religious structures or secular structures. It does not matter whether they are structures which are very, very old, thus being called as monument, or structures that are very new, just constructed recently, whether it is Vikas Sauda or it could be the UB towers that Vijay Mallya constructed in Bangalore. So whatever be the argument of historians and cultural cultural historians, cultural studies scholars, is that a historian and a scholar should actively engage with all of these visual representations, because buildings or monuments are not just meant to be looked at or appreciated for its beauty or aesthetics. Instead, they are very powerful statements that talk about political condition of a period or the economy or the society or social structures and social biases, etc. So we are going to start with structures. How do they become political statements? Now, one of the major problems for a state, whether the state is of the recent one or older period, whether it is the state as a patron or individuals as a patron, patrons of buildings, patrons supporting structures constantly undergo an issue of or a dilemma of gaining legitimacy and justifying their act. Especially when the state is a patron of architecture, the state constantly is under pressure to legitimize its own existence. Whether the state is the recent state or the state of yesteryear, the king or the monarch would have constantly been under pressure to legitimize the way he has come to power, justify his actions, which is what the present state also is under. So, as a result, for all of these states, for all of these dilemmas to be overcome, the state as a patron started looking at various ways, looking at various trajectories to re-establish or to emphasize its legitimacy, to emphasize its legitimate existence and justify whatever bills, whatever policies, whatever legislations that the state would have introduced. So, as a result, specifically in ancient medieval as well as in modern period, institutions, whether they are very large business conglomerations like probably the Birlas, or whether it is the state itself, they constantly use religious images as a way of justifying and legitimizing their authority and their power. So the might of the state gets reflected in the kind of monument. Hello? Okay. In the kind of monument or in the kind of building that comes into existence. So there are, when one looks at these representations, there are a number of examples available to us. Now, this, as all of us are familiar, is the famous Ashoka pillar at Saranath, though the top part has fallen off. Now, when one looks at this, it is a common belief that Republic India, as in 1947, when India became independent and a republican state, the Indian state decided to go in for a neutral kind of a symbol, and hence the Oriental historians had already by then eulogized and looked at Ashoka as a benevolent ruler, as a tolerant ruler, and so they borrowed the symbol of Ashoka. However, this symbol is also not free from political consideration. Now, why did Ashoka bring in this? I'm just giving random examples to prove and to argue my point that structures are always political statements. Now, here, this is a representation of the Buddhist symbol, because in Buddhist legend or in Buddhism, primarily Buddhism as a tradition, as a practicing faith, or as an institution, there are several symbols that are associated with Buddha. So, whether it is the lion, Buddha was called as Sakya Simha, and the Ashokan pillar, it constantly has four animals going around the down part of the capital. Okay, and these animals, they are horse and elephant, and then a bull and a lion. Now, all of these are closely related or connected to the Buddhist liturgy and Buddhist tradition. For example, the horse is considered as a sign of the last renunciation of Buddha or Siddhartha, because Siddhartha ordered his charioteer Channa to bring the chariot, and the chariot was pulled by his horse Kantaka. So Kantaka is considered as the last symbol of Gautama Siddhartha's association with materialistic life. So the point of renunciation. And the bull is the Vrishabha Rashi in which Buddha was born. Elephant is the Airavata that Buddha's mother, Mahamaya, dreamt of entering her womb before she conceived Buddha and gave birth to Siddhartha or Buddha. So whether it is the lion or the bull or the horse, they constantly connect with Buddhism and for Ashoka, who had just then captured Kalinga after a violent struggle. It was one of the most violent struggle that the Mauryan state had to wage, and as a result, the Mauryan state was under tremendous pressure to win over the citizens of Kalinga. And Kalinga being a port city, Kalinga is in present-day Odisha region. Kalinga being a port city was dominated by the heterodoxies, by traders, by merchants who were all practitioners of heterodoxies, either Buddhism or Jainism. So Ashoka is said to have used religion as a tool or as a medium to win over the support of the Kalingans, to win over the support of large majority of traders who were there, who were Buddhists, and thus he brought in a series of symbols that would represent the Mauryan state's allegiance to that of Buddhism. So, using of Buddhism, using faith as well as monument was one way of representing the state's newfound loyalty towards faith that was popularized, that was being followed by the people of that area. Now, this is not very specific to any single faith. It is not that only the Mauryan state. Is there an interruption? May I continue? Am I audible?
Yes, madam.
Yes, madam.
Okay.
Go ahead, madam.
Yeah. So this kind of state using faith or monument was not restricted or limited to only Buddhism. This is, as we can all recognize, is the great Brihadishwara temple at Tanjavur. Now here also, constructed by Rajaraja Chola, the construction was begun exactly as the data, historical data tells us or informs us. The construction was begun exactly after Rajaraja Chola's Southeast Asian campaign. The Cholas were known for their naval fleet. So towards Southeast Asia, whole area of the present-day Indochina region. Indochina is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So those Indochina regions were captured by the Chola Navy. And similarly, they went right up to the Spice Islands, that is Indonesia, so Bali, Java, Sumatra. All of these brought in immense wealth to the Chola Empire. Okay, and the Chola state was a recipient of not just the wealth of these states, but was a recipient of a complete control over it, the entire trade route, maritime route from India to Southeast Asia was now under the monopoly of the Chola Navy. So as a result, all those vessels which would pass by this through the Malacca Strait area would have to pay a kind of a fees for protecting that route, etc. So the capture of these Southeast Asian territories brought immense bounty to the Chola Empire. And that got reflected in the construction of the Brihadishwara temple. Now, having constructed this temple, how did Rajaraja Chola use this as a way of re-emphasizing his legitimacy and justifying his Southeast Asian campaign? The construction of the temple and the naming of the temple was a way that he brought out. So it was not just Brihadishwaram. It was called as Brihadishwara by the people of the area. It was a colloquial term because it was very huge. It was Brihat, meaning very huge, and it was an Ishvara temple. But the official name for the temple was Rajarajeshwara temple. So by constructing the temple, Raja Chola was equating his authority or his persona, his image with that of the temple and the Lord and the deity there. And it was a way of communicating an idea to his people that he represents divinity on earth and he is a co-sharer, a co-partner for power along with the Lord. So the inscriptions, these are the inscriptions on the base of the temple itself. And all of these inscriptions point out to that. Now, this is, of course, the Rashtrapati Bhavan. and the Rashtrapati Bhavan also. So what I am trying to argue out is whether it is the ancient structures or whether it is the colonial buildings or post-colonial buildings, all of them, they represent the might of the state. And when this building was being constructed, they took very deep care not to alienate the citizens of India by constructing a completely European style building. So the Rashtrapati Bhavan and the Parliament, they were incorporated with a lot of features. For example, if one is familiar with the Sanchi Stupa, the entire dome, this is the Suchi and Taba section of the Sanchi Stupa, and this is the under portion of the stupa itself. So they constantly incorporated the images that Indians were familiar with to make colonial power acceptable and to bring in an idea that colonial power of the British government was not too alien, but it had become quite indigenized. Now, if we are looking at this, now this is the west view of the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, if you look at this building without anyone telling us what it is, many of us will mistake it to be a Greek building in some part of Europe. Because if you look at the pillars and the facade, this is the facade, this is the entrance of the building. And if one looks at these pillars or these columns, they are an exact replica of the Ionic columns. The Greek column construction or the style of pillar construction in Greece, they had three styles: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. And since America was a nation that was designed and set up by the Europeans who migrated there, they carried the same symbols of authenticity, same symbols of acceptance, or same symbols of historicity, the Greek stylistic construction, into America. So the early periods of American history was dominated by European symbols itself. So it's a way of once again legitimizing the authority of the state. Now here we are looking at another important way. How do we look at, or the question may be, yes, these are all political statements. How do we infer history from these statements or from these buildings? How do we extract history from these buildings? And how do the buildings by themselves become a source? Now, a very clear-cut answer to that question is how the buildings are constructed in Kashmir area in Ladakh territory. Now, I'm showing this map just to give a very brief background to the campaign. Now, here is the Kashmir area, and till around approximately 7th century Common Era, Jammu Kashmir belt was known for its Hindu and Buddhist faith. It was a very strong center of Shaivism. Kashmiri Shaivism was known across the entire subcontinent. But then, from around 7th century Common Era, there was the Turco-Afghan entry into the Indian subcontinent from the regions of Kabul. Here is Afghanistan, and to the west of Afghanistan is Persia or Iran. So from this area, there was an entry of the Turco-Afghan belt from the area of Gandhara or Afghanistan into that of the Indian subcontinent. And with the arrival of this faith into India, the Islamic faith, the Turco-Afghan invasion also came along with the faith that they were practicing. So the entry of a Judeo-Abrahamic faith into a largely Buddhist area very quickly changed the method of construction, the method of building or designing their monuments itself, or designing their building itself. For example, this is in the present-day Jammu Kashmir region. So from northwest into Ladakh area, into Kashmir area. So I'm showing you buildings which are examples of the pre-Turco-Afghan entry and the post-Turco-Afghan entry. Now, this is a 7th century monastery, Buddhist monastery, which is before the Turko-Afghan invasion began. 7th century is 600 Common Era, when Islam was yet to get established in the Indian subcontinent. Now, this is the Alchin monastery. And all those 7th century, all those monasteries in Ladakh region constructed prior to the Turko-Afghan entry were all horizontal in nature. You can look at how all of them are spread out. They are just ground floor structure or single storied structures across. However, with the arrival of the Turko-Afghan invasion and very intense conflicts, military conflicts, and then conflicts over the faith, etc., the entire construction of Buddhist monasteries from 8th century Common Era drastically changed. So we are looking at another monastery. This is a 9th century monastery called as the Tikse monastery. And the moment the invasions happened, the entire construction of monastery became more fortified in nature. It became more vertical in nature rather than remaining horizontal like this. So vertical meant that they started constructing fort walls. So what happened was the monastery would be at the top of the fortified walls, and the entire agricultural field would be at the base level. So this was meant to protect themselves from invasion. So the nature and design of architecture and monuments, they shifted based on the political reality that these areas were facing, or political changes or political shifts that these areas were experiencing. Similarly, now this is the famous Bamiyan Valley, where structures are political statements. So this was a valley that connected, was located within the land trade route between Europe and that of Asia. Here in this part, this is the great Hindu Kush mountain ranges, and this Bamiyan Valley had was patronized by Buddhist merchants because Buddhism traveled along with trade route. Buddhism also used the same route to travel across into Central Asia, from India to Central Asia, to that of Afghanistan, and to that of China also. So throughout the way, they had Buddhist statues, but with the Taliban regime coming in, which was hardcore fundamentalist Islamic government or state, there was a non-acceptance of non-Islamic presence in the Bamiyan Valley or in Afghanistan. So the Taliban government ordered for all these Buddhist bas reliefs to get destroyed, and as a result, the structures reveal the changed political nature or political status of a territory itself. So these were niches, or these were areas that were completely devoid of Buddhist statues. So one is looking at how structures have always been considered as major part of political processes, or structures can always be accepted as political statements. Now, there is a way of politicizing the structures also. It is not that structures are never politicized. One of the biggest problems, as in the structures become sources for understanding political history. And how do they become a source for political history? A very big dilemma for students of history is, how do one place, or how do one locate who the actual builder was and who the patron was? Now, this is a very serious dilemma because many of the buildings do not carry the name of the actual builder, either the Shreni or the guild which constructed, the masons who were involved, the artisan who were involved, or it does not even carry the architect who designed. Rather, all buildings go in the name of the patron who provided a certain kind of financial and land benefit or land arrangement for the building. So there is a very strong politicizing of structures also that goes into it. For example, in Karnataka, there is a common saying that Dakanachari constructed the Hoysala structure, Hoysala monuments, etc. Actually, it is not Dakanachari. It's a abbreviation of Dakshinada Achari. Acharis were guilds. Acharis were skilled masons, and Dakshina was southern India. So it was the guild which brought these buildings into reality, but nowhere are their names. Neither the guild, nor the artisan, nor the designer. None of their contribution ever gets figured in the monument. So the monument is a symbol of both political statement because it gives out a lot of these political details, and it is also a symbol of how structures or how ideas and how power was constantly politicized. Okay. Similarly, now this is, for example, I'm just randomly showing structures. Now this is the Kaleshwara temple in Gadag district, and it is called as Kallapachanagudi. Now that is what these two names in documents in court records, it is called as Kaleshwara Devalaya, whereas for the local indigenous people or for the regional people or for the people of the village or area, they do not recognize this official name. Constantly, they refer to it as Kallapachanagudi, but not as Kaleshwara Devalaya. So there is a binary between how a state or a patron identified the monument and how the local community responds to a structure. This is Nanneshwara again, and then Damban. So all of these structures, whether it is a Devalaya or whether it is a Jaina Basadi. This is a Basadi, and this is Trikoteshwara in Gadag district. Now, whether it is a Devalaya or a Basadi or a church or a masjid or a mosque, regardless of the faith, regardless of the time period in which it was constructed, structures constantly emerge as a representation of the power, authority of the patron. And in most of the cases, the patron will always be either a economic patron, which could be business houses or business conglomerates, etc. So this is one part. May I go ahead? The reason I constantly stop is because I have converted the pictures into full screen. I cannot read the read the messages or have a look at anyone.
Yeah, you can carry on, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Now, the second part here is how structures become social statements. Now, how do they become social statements? Primarily, structures constantly are demarcated. I'm just giving one example. They are constantly demarcated and they are segregated into being impacted or into showing or into representing how they are gendered, how they are dominated by caste and class considerations. Okay, all structures are constantly dominated by caste, class, and gendering. In India, it could be caste, or abroad, it could be race, because we do not have. If one looks at the history of architecture in America, there are separate churches for the Black Africans, that is, as in the Afro-American Americans, and the white Americans, they are separated. So structures are representation of the racial practices, caste practices, gendered practices in a society. So constantly, the question that historians ask is, who are the owners? To whom does the structure belong? Now, this is an important question because especially when the buildings or when the monuments are public monuments, as in my house is a private building. So I can always decide who has access into my home. But a temple or a church or whatever it is, they are all public buildings and they are in theory accessible to the entire community. However, because of the segregation and demarcation of the space in a building or in a monument, the question of who has access, to whom does it belong, constantly crops up. So, what happens is, traditionally, a public building is the right of the entire community. The whole community, as it belongs to them, as they have contributed for the structure itself, building of the structure, etc., as they are also the ones who are nurturing the building or maintaining the building, they are rightful owners. So it is a right. However, access into the structure is a privilege that is extended only to a few based on their gender, based on their caste, or based on their class. So constantly, though public spaces are argued as being common to everyone, that is why they are called as public space. It can be a well. It is a common well. Everybody theoretically should have access to the well, but in reality, it is a demarcated space based on traditions, based on ideas of orthodoxy, based on the notions of what is real in the society. So there is a constant hierarchy of including some, excluding some. So that exclusion activity that continuously goes on could be based on the class to which I belong. It could be a very large hotel, and because I belong to a different class, I may not have access to that, or I may have access. It's dependent on the structure. So we are looking at, for example, I'm just looking at some of the structures which are gendered. Now, this is a church where it is a place of worship, accessible. Theoretically, it should be accessible to all. But then access in the church stops only till the pew. Pew is where the believers are seated. Who has access to the podium or to the rostrum? It is always the men, as in men become priests and they have access. Women cannot go into this part of the church at all. Similarly, this is a rough drawing of the basic plan of any Devalaya. Now, this is the Garbhagriha, the neck part, this is the Antarada, and this is the Navaranga or the Mandapa. So, when one looks at how accessible a Devalaya is, accessibility is based on both caste and class. For, in terms of caste, people belonging to certain caste, though Devalaya is a public space, people belonging to certain castes cannot even enter into the building at any part, but women belonging to the privileged caste can enter the building but should stay only in the Navaranga or the Mandapa. Women do not have an access into the Garbhagriha. So spaces, public spaces are constantly gendered. The gendering of space is so strong. I'm showing a view of this is in Sandur. This is, on to the left of the screen is the Parvati temple. To the right of the screen is a Subramanya temple. Now, the gendering of Subramanya or the gendering of the space is so strong that a side, a woman looking at the main image or the main deity is considered as being not sacred, as being not sanctified, okay, as being sinful. And so they have erected or installed a block. So a woman walking across this temple, even if accidentally looks at the temple, her sight or her view should not fall onto the main deity. So spaces are constantly gendered like this. Now, it is not just structures and spaces are politically, dominated or gendered or caste class, but buildings are constant source of economic data or economic information. Now, one of the major issues, especially in India, has been most of the Devalayas or Basadis or even Chaityagrahas. Chaityagrahas are Buddhist temples, Basadis are Jain temples. and Devalayas are Hindu temples. So most of these are constructed in non-perishable materials like stone. For example, we have a 1,000-year-old temple like the Brihadishwara temple. But where are 1,000-year-old palaces available? Where are 1,000-year-old auditoriums, libraries, cities? Where are they? We do not come across any remaining examples or even ruins of those cities. Only the places of worship were constructed in hard granite stone, and as a result, they came to be considered as very strong structures. And wherever there was a necessity, because these were constructed in stone, the temples became centers of holding of the treasury, the chest of the local area. So temples became repositories of wealth for three reasons. One, the believers started granting to the temple. There were inscriptions which said Kerayum, Bhaviyum, Kattisi, Punyam, as in constructing a temple, constructing a kere or a lake or a well were all considered as being very auspicious act. So people donated generously to the temple. Both the patron donated generously, the believers donated generously. So by around 9th century Common Era in India, temples had become repositories of great wealth that they derived from the grants that they were getting. Point one. Second, because the temples were constructed in imperishable material like stones, it was also considered as the safest place to protect the treasury or the box or the exchequer, etc. So, because of temples becoming economic centers, now because they started receiving so much of grants, the temples started emerging themselves as administrative unit. The larger the temple, the more grant. And the temple would be owners of agricultural fields. Temples would be owners of business establishments. So they had to have an administrative structure to manage that wealth. And they also started expanding. More the number of people who came, visited the temple, the infrastructure also had to develop to accommodate these inflow of pilgrims or inflow of people. So whole temples developed cities around them, towns around them, so they became temple towns and cities. So that meant for any invading army, temple became the source of attraction because it was literally sitting on so much of wealth. And when I say this, regardless of the faith, we have a very orthodox opinion that it was Islamic campaigns that hit temples, whereas the others did not. That is one of the biggest fallacies that we have. All invasions, whether they were Islamic rulers or Hindu rulers or whoever the rulers were, invading armies constantly targeted the temples for the wealth it had. The only difference was if the invading army belonged to a different faith, they never repaired or reconstructed the monument. They just took the loot, took the money, took the wealth and retreated. But if the invading army was of the same faith, they brought in renovation or reconstruction or repair to the existing monument. So all rulers and all invading armies constantly attacked temple because of the wealth that it contained. So as a result of this, by around 9th, 10th century onwards, gradually, a practice developed where temples started constructing defense installations around their structure. They constructed high compound walls or gateways, and they also constructed watchtowers in the temple, and they had temple guards staying in these watchtowers to warn the temple of the watchtowers. Now, if you look at this, this is an example of Darasuram and temples in Tamil Nadu. Now, if you look at this, this is not the Shikhara. there is a difference between the Shikara and Gopura. Shikara is on top of the Garbhagriha. It is a tower over the Garbhagriha. Whereas Gopura is a tower over the entry gate, the Prakara wall or the compound wall over the entry gate. And this is an image of the Gopura. Now, if one looks at it very carefully, the Gopura has windows at each level. And they are hollow construction. They can be accessed from the steps constructed on the side. So the guards would be stationed. This would act as a view or watch window for the temple guards to warn of the impending attack or the oncoming attack. So all of these structures, this is a Shikara. This is the Shikara on Brihadishwara. Look at how the Shikara does not have any windows or any, it's one massive solid construction, whereas the Gopuras will always have windows like this. This is the Madurai Meenakshi temple. This is the Gopura on the entrance gateway, which has windows going right up to the top. One can climb right up to the top, and that acted as a watchtower for the construction. This is Hampe Virupaksha temple, and again these are watchtowers to warn the temple guards about the impending attack. So these components or these structures, they show how temples were economic statements or structures were economic statements. They were not just economic statements, both in terms of the massive construction. For example, even after to construct such a large building, the patron had to be economically self-sufficient in terms of giving land and affording the expense of hiring labor, affording the expense of bringing in various specialist guilds to construct a building, etc. So a building, a structure is always a representation of the economic might of the patron, the economic power of the patron. This is another view of, a closer view of the Gopura itself above the entrance gateway. So today they have just blockaded in order to prevent people from constantly using the space. They have blockaded these, but these acted as watch towers. So what one is looking at is, this is the Shikara of the Shore temple at Mahabalipuram, which is different. Whereas, see, the Shikara does not have any watchtowers, the Shore temple, whereas the Gopura, this is Padmanabha Swami temple in Thiruvananthapuram, and this is the Gopura. One can climb right up to the top and have a look at the surrounding areas. So temples emerged as primarily, or structures, whether it is temple or whether it is secular buildings, they were constant representation of the economic power, the economic wealth of the patron. This is the Shikara. Okay.